My parents gave my brother $5 million to start his dream business and told me to leave because they claimed I was just wasting space in their world. I cut them out of my life and never looked back. 5 years later, his empire collapsed completely, and he was forced to move back into his childhood bedroom. When he drove past my beachfront villa, he broke down weeping and screaming to our mother, asking why I get to have everything. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to a family who underestimated your worth and treated you like a stepping stone. My name is Alana. I am 31 years old, and I work in commercial real estate investment and corporate acquisitions. I am sharp and I am practical, because life never gave me the luxury of being anything else. To understand exactly how I orchestrated the absolute financial ruin of my golden child brother and reclaimed my peace, you have to go back 5 years to the Thanksgiving dinner that set my vengeance into motion. The dining room of my parents' house in Atlanta was suffocatingly warm and smelled of roasted turkey collard greens and expensive entitlement. The roasted turkey sat untouched in the center of the table, surrounded by silver platters of macaroni and cheese and candied yams. It was a feast designed to photograph well for my mother to post online, showing off her flawless domestic life to the church congregation. We were seated around a massive mahogany table that my mother Brenda polished obsessively. She was wearing a tailored designer dress that she had bought specifically to wear to our mega church the following Sunday. In our family, public image was not just a priority, it was a religion. My father, Calvin, sat at the head of the table pouring a highly expensive glass of red wine. He was a man who cared more about his status on the church elder board than he cared about his own daughter. Sitting to his right was my older brother, DeAndre. DeAndre was 33 years old, incredibly handsome, dangerously charming, and utterly useless. He was the undisputed golden son, the supposed future of our family legacy. Next to him sat his 30-year-old white wife, Courtney. Courtney was a woman who loved the aesthetic of Black culture, but had absolutely no respect for the struggles of the people who created it. She wore her proximity to my brother like an accessory, and spent most of her time practicing subtle ways to remind me that she had married into wealth while I was just scraping by. I was 26 at the time, working 80-hour weeks trying to build a career in commercial real estate after having to teach myself finance. That condo was my sanctuary. I had saved every spare dollar for the down payment, and my father had co-signed the loan only because my credit history was completely empty at the time. He had used that technicality to maintain legal leverage over my only asset. I had just taken a bite of candied yams when the heavy thud of rolling luggage echoed from the hallway. My mother walked into the dining room dragging 2 large suitcases. I recognized them immediately because they belonged to me. She hauled them right up to the dining table and dropped them next to my chair. The heavy impact rattled the crystal water glasses. I looked at the bags and then up at my mother, feeling a cold knot form in my stomach. I asked her what my packed luggage was doing in the middle of Thanksgiving dinner. My father did not even look up from slicing his turkey. He casually reached into his tailored suit jacket and pulled out a thick legal document. He slid it across the polished mahogany table until it stopped right in front of my plate. It was a quitclaim deed. I stared at the bold black letters at the top of the page, trying to process what was happening. My father wiped his mouth with a linen napkin and spoke with a terrifying calmness. He told me to sign the paper immediately and hand over the keys to my condo. I sat there in stunned silence, reminding him that I had been paying exactly half of the mortgage on that apartment for the past 3 years. I asked him what right he had to demand my home. My mother took her seat next to my father, smoothing her pristine skirt. She looked at me not with a motherly warmth, but with the cold calculation of a business manager cutting a bad investment. She said the family was liquidating the condo to gather $5 million in startup capital for DeAndre. He was launching a luxury logistics company called Vanguard Freight. According to my mother, an unmarried 26-year-old woman like me was simply wasting space and tying up valuable assets. She told me I needed to pack my things and move out by morning so they could clear the property for the bank. She actually used the phrase that I needed to yield my resources to support the family legacy. DeAndre leaned back in his chair, swirling his wine with a deeply arrogant smirk. He did not say a word because he did not have to. He was the prince waiting to be crowned. He believed he was destined to be the face of Black excellence for our family. Our parents were obsessed with building a generational wealth narrative to flaunt in front of the congregation, and DeAndre was their chosen vessel. I was just collateral damage. I looked at the deed again, feeling the betrayal burn in my throat. Before I could even articulate a response, Courtney leaned forward. She rested her manicured hands on the table and offered me a patronizing smile. She told me not to be so aggressive, and her voice dripped with that specific type of weaponized politeness. She said DeAndre is actually building generational wealth for this family, while I just hustle small commercial leases downtown. She told me I should look at giving up my condo as a donation to his brilliance, and that it was the least I could do to support a visionary. Hearing a white woman sitting at my family table telling me a Black woman not to be aggressive, while she casually supported stealing my home, was a level of disrespect I could barely comprehend. The microaggression hung in the air, heavy and toxic. My own parents nodded in agreement with her. They actually smiled at Courtney, validating her insult. I looked at my father and felt the last remaining thread of my familial loyalty snap entirely. I pushed my plate away and leaned across the table. I asked my father if he really wanted to talk about donations and sacrifices. I reminded him in a very clear and steady voice about what happened 5 years prior. I asked him if he remembered draining my entire college savings account to pay for high-priced defense lawyers and a massive out-of-court settlement because DeAndre crashed a car while driving heavily intoxicated. I reminded them that his golden boy image was about to be ruined with a felony record, so they sacrificed my tuition money to keep his record clean. I had to drop out of university and teach myself how to survive in the corporate world, while DeAndre got a clean slate and a brand new car. My father slammed his fist onto the table, causing Courtney to jump. He pointed a perfectly manicured finger at my face. He yelled that DeAndre had a future and needed a clean record to succeed in the corporate world. He told me I was being selfish for bringing up the past. He said I owed this family for raising me, and that if I did not sign the quitclaim deed right then and there, he would use his parental authority to completely cut me off from his corporate health insurance plan. He knew I needed that insurance because I was dealing with a chronic health issue at the time. It was blatant, unadulterated blackmail. I looked around the table at the people who shared my blood. My mother was glaring at me, impatient for me to comply. DeAndre looked bored by the whole conversation, already spending the millions in his head. Courtney was giving me a look of pure condescension. There was no love in this room. There was only utility, and I had outlived mine. I did not cry. I did not scream or beg. The realization that they truly saw me as nothing but a stepping stone for my brother settled over me like a sheet of ice. I picked up the expensive silver pen lying next to the document. I flipped to the back page and signed my name, relinquishing my equity in the condo. I pushed the paper back across the table to my father. He snatched it up immediately, looking triumphant. My mother let out a loud breath of relief and told me I was finally doing the right thing for God and for the family. DeAndre raised his wineglass in a mock toast to my departure. I stood up from the table slowly. I walked over to the side counter where DeAndre had left his open laptop connected to a charging station. He had been using it to show my parents his grand business presentation before dinner. Sticking out of the side of the machine was a small silver flash drive. For the past 6 months, I had been using my industry connections to build a massive comprehensive database of potential shipping clients, vendor contacts, and logistical routes. I had done all the heavy lifting for his business plan because he was too lazy to do the research himself. That flash drive contained the entire operational foundation of Vanguard Freight. I reached out and smoothly unplugged the flash drive, slipping it silently into my pocket. None of them noticed. They were too busy congratulating themselves on securing the $5 million. I grabbed the handles of my 2 suitcases. I looked at my family one last time. I told my father that $5 million would not buy his son a functioning brain. I told Courtney to enjoy the generational wealth while it lasted. I walked out the front door into a heavy freezing rain. The door clicked shut behind me, severing my ties to my past forever. As I stood on the wet pavement dragging my luggage toward the street, my phone vibrated in my coat pocket. I pulled it out and looked at the glowing screen through the raindrops. It was a text message from a highly elusive billionaire investor I had been secretly pitching my own business model to for months. The message was brief, but it changed the trajectory of my entire existence. It read, "Seed capital approved. Let us start the hostile takeover." The heavy rain instantly soaked through my thin coat, but the cold felt incredibly refreshing. I took a deep breath of the damp air, letting the reality of my new freedom wash over me. I was completely unburdened. I no longer had to pretend to respect a father who viewed me as collateral damage, or a mother who saw me as an inconvenience. I no longer had to tolerate a brother who stole my resources or a sister-in-law who mocked my existence. I smiled into the dark, rainy night. They thought they had left me with nothing. They had no idea they had just handed me the freedom to conquer their world. I walked into the storm ready to build an empire that would eventually swallow theirs whole. 5 years is a long time to live in the shadows, but it is exactly the amount of time required to build an empire from scratch. I did not spend those years grieving the family I lost or complaining about the home that was stolen from me. I spent them working with a cold and singular focus. The flash drive I took from DeAndre's laptop that rainy Thanksgiving night was the blueprint to everything he thought he was going to build. It contained proprietary client lists, vendor contracts, and regional logistics routes. I used that data to secure my initial seed capital from a private backer who recognized my hunger. Within 2 years, I had quietly absorbed 3 of Vanguard Freight's biggest regional competitors. Apex Holdings was born, not in a flashy boardroom with expensive caterers, but in the quiet, dark hours of my absolute obsession. I became a phantom CEO, operating entirely behind layers of corporate structuring and non-disclosure agreements. While my business grew to dominate the commercial real estate and private equity sectors of Atlanta, I remained invisible. I wore unbranded, modest clothing. I drove a practical, reliable sedan. I lived in a simple apartment. I understood early on that true wealth is silent, and true power never needs to announce itself when it walks into a room. My family, on the other hand, was deafeningly loud. DeAndre and Courtney lived their lives like a televised spectacle of artificial success. They leased a pristine white Bentley that they could not afford. They wore designer clothing plastered with massive logos. They posted their luxury vacations on social media to create the illusion of infinite generational wealth. My parents fed off this illusion like starving people. It was their oxygen. They needed the congregation of their megachurch to look at them with envy and admiration. They needed the world to believe that their golden son was the living embodiment of Black excellence. It was a Sunday morning in mid-July when their beautiful illusion finally collided with the brutal reality of mathematics. My parents attended a massive church in the wealthiest suburb of the city. The sanctuary looked more like a concert arena, complete with velvet seating, theatrical lighting, and massive projection screens. I had received a rare text message from my mother demanding my attendance because the family was being specially recognized by the pastor. I arrived wearing a simple tailored beige dress. The fabric was expensive, but it completely lacked the flashy, recognizable labels that my family associated with worth. The moment I walked into the heavily carpeted foyer, my mother intercepted me. She looked me up and down with that familiar expression of disappointed tolerance. She handed me a church bulletin and pointed toward the back of the auditorium. She told me that the front rows were strictly reserved for business leaders and major donors today. She explained that DeAndre was presenting a check for $100,000 to the church building fund, and it was crucial that the aesthetic of the front row reflected prosperity. She actually told me that my plain outfit, would disrupt the visual harmony of their success and ordered me to sit in the overflow seating. I just nodded calmly and walked to the back of the room. I took a seat among the strangers and watched my family parade down the center aisle like royalty. Calvin puffed out his chest as the pastor called him and DeAndre to the altar. They proudly handed over an oversized novelty check while the congregation erupted in enthusiastic applause. My father took the microphone and talked extensively about the blessings of building a legacy. He spoke about DeAndre as a visionary leader who was paving the way for the next generation. The hypocrisy was thick enough to choke on. I knew exactly where that $100,000 had come from. I knew this because Apex Holdings had been silently tracking Vanguard Freight's financial health for months. That money was supposed to cover their commercial warehouse insurance premiums and their fleet maintenance costs. They were bleeding cash at a catastrophic rate, but DeAndre and my father chose to buy a fleeting moment of church clout instead of paying their legitimate operating expenses. After the service concluded, the congregation mingled in the grand fellowship hall. Expensive coffee was poured and pastries were served on silver trays. I stood quietly near a marble pillar sipping my coffee and watching the room. That was when Courtney spotted me. She walked over with an arrogant sway, linking her arm tightly through DeAndre's. She wore a loud floral designer dress and a massive diamond ring that I knew for a fact was financed on a high-interest credit card. My parents flanked them, beaming at the admiring church members passing by. Courtney looked at my simple beige dress and sighed with a deeply manufactured pity. She tilted her head and asked if I was still struggling downtown. Her voice was intentionally loud enough for the neighboring groups of wealthy churchgoers to hear. She said it was such a shame that I was not living up to my potential and that I was still hustling for pennies. She smiled sweetly and patted my arm, telling me that DeAndre was actually looking for a new receptionist at Vanguard Freight. She said the pay was minimal, but she could probably convince him to lower the educational requirements so I could have a stable job. She told me it would be a great way for me to finally contribute to the family legacy, instead of just scraping by as an embarrassment. My mother chuckled softly at the insult, covering her mouth with her hand. My father looked away, pretending to be interested in a nearby conversation. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my coffee. I looked at Courtney, and then I shifted my gaze directly to DeAndre. I did not raise my voice or show any emotion. I spoke with the cold, mechanical precision of a corporate auditor. I said, "A receptionist position sounds interesting, but I would have to pass." I explained that I would not feel secure working for a company that has not paid its warehouse lease in 4 consecutive months. The silence that fell over our small circle was absolute and immediate. Courtney's smug smile froze completely on her face. My mother's eyes darted around the hall in sheer panic to see if anyone had heard me. My father turned back around, his jaw tightening with silent rage. I set my coffee cup down on a passing waiter's tray and continued my assessment. I asked DeAndre how he planned to cover his administrative payroll next week, since his primary logistics contractor filed a class action lawsuit against him on Thursday for unpaid trucking fees. I casually mentioned that federal courts do not usually accept novelty church checks to settle corporate debts. All the color instantly drained from DeAndre's face. He looked like a man who had just been shoved out of an airplane without a parachute. My mother stepped forward and hissed at me to keep my voice down. She accused me of making up vicious lies because I was insanely jealous of my brother's incredible success. But DeAndre knew it was not a lie. The truth terrified him. He stepped forward and grabbed my elbow. His fingers dug hard into my skin as he physically pulled me behind the large decorative pillar away from the crowd. His polished charm was completely gone. His eyes were wide, frantic, and bloodshot. He backed me against the cold marble wall and demanded to know how I had that confidential information. His breath smelled of panic and expensive mints. He told me the lawsuit was sealed and the lease issue was a strictly private vendor dispute. He threatened me in a low, trembling whisper. He said if I ever spoke a single word of this to anyone in the church or the business community, he would completely destroy me. He called me a bitter nobody who was trying to ruin his empire out of spite. I looked down at his hand gripping my arm. I did not flinch. I calmly told him to remove his hand immediately, or I would have my personal security team break his fingers. He laughed a harsh, desperate sound and asked what security team a broke commercial broker could possibly afford. I just stared at him with empty, dead eyes until the realization that I was not joking made him slowly release his grip. He stepped back, breathing heavily. I walked out of the church without looking back, leaving him sweating and shaking behind the marble pillar. The panic I instilled in DeAndre that morning quickly infected my parents. They desperately did not want to believe their golden child was failing, but the seed of fear had been firmly planted in their minds. Over the next few weeks, the reality of Vanguard Freight's collapse became entirely impossible to ignore. Creditors started calling the family house looking for DeAndre. Vendors formally refused to deliver essential supplies. Instead of holding DeAndre accountable for his gross mismanagement, my parents chose the path of ultimate delusion. They convinced themselves that it was just a temporary cash flow problem caused by a biased corporate system trying to hold back a successful black business. They decided they had to save the family legacy at all costs. My parents lived in a sprawling $2 million mansion that my father had spent his entire adult life paying off. It was his ultimate symbol of arrival and the physical manifestation of his pride. Blinded by their toxic devotion to DeAndre and terrified of losing their prestigious status in the religious community, my parents made a fatal, catastrophic error. They went to a secondary local lender and took out a massive secret second mortgage on the family estate. They pulled out every single ounce of equity they had meticulously built over 30 years and handed the cash directly to DeAndre to save his crumbling company. They gambled their entire foundation on a sinking ship, hoping no one would ever find out. They had absolutely no idea who was controlling the financial currents in their city. A week later, I was sitting in my corner office at the headquarters of Apex Holdings. The room was fiercely minimalist, defined by dark wood and floor-to-ceiling glass overlooking the Atlanta skyline. The surface of my desk was completely clear except for a single black leather folder. My vice president of acquisitions, a sharp, analytical man named Marcus, walked into the room. He did not knock because we operated purely on efficiency and speed. He handed me a digital tablet containing a freshly acquired portfolio of bad debt from a struggling regional bank. Apex Holdings regularly bought up distressed debt bundles for pennies on the dollar to ruthlessly leverage the underlying assets. Marcus told me to review the residential section of the portfolio. He explained that the regional bank had issued several high-risk secondary mortgages recently and was now quietly offloading them to generate quick liquidity to satisfy regulators. I scrolled through the digital files, the names and addresses blurred together in a stream of mundane financial data, until one specific property suddenly caught my eye. It was the exact address of the mansion I grew up in. The names Calvin and Brenda were listed as the primary debtors on a brand new, highly leveraged second mortgage. They had collateralized the very roof over their heads for a desperate $2 million cash injection. I stared at the glowing screen, tracing the numbers with my eyes. The irony of the situation was almost poetic. 5 years ago, they kicked me out of my home into the freezing rain to fund his dream. Now they were risking their own home to delay his inevitable nightmare. I handed the tablet back to Marcus. I looked out at the sprawling city below me, feeling an absolute profound sense of calm. I told him to isolate that specific mortgage from the bundle. I told him to buy it immediately. I instructed him not to negotiate the price, but to just acquire the debt completely and transfer the paperwork to my personal holding company. I wanted to own the physical paper that dictated my parents' future. Marcus nodded, understanding the directive without needing an explanation, and walked out of the office to execute the trade. I turned my leather chair back toward the window and watched the traffic far below. The trap was perfectly set. They had willingly walked right into the snare and handed me the rope. It was only a matter of time before I pulled it tight. Let me explain exactly how deep the rot went within Vanguard Freight. DeAndre had taken the original $5 million and structured his business like a vanity project rather than a logistics firm. Instead of investing in reliable trucks, paying competitive wages to experienced drivers, or securing long-term warehouse leases, he spent the capital on aggressive marketing and personal branding. He rented a lavish corporate office downtown that cost $30,000 a month just so he could take photos behind a mahogany desk. He hired a bloated executive team of his fraternity brothers who knew absolutely nothing about supply chain management. Meanwhile, the actual operations of the company were falling apart. Packages were routinely delayed, perishable goods spoiled on loading docks because he refused to pay for refrigerated transport. The truckers he contracted were forced to work grueling hours, and when they demanded their rightful overtime pay, DeAndre simply ignored their invoices. Courtney was equally complicit in the financial hemorrhage. She viewed Vanguard Freight as her personal, limitless bank account. While the drivers were organizing their class action lawsuit, she was flying first class to Paris and Milan, posting photos of her shopping sprees and tagging them with hashtags about generational wealth and boss wife life. She hired a full-time social media manager to document her luxury lifestyle, completely oblivious to the fact that every designer handbag she purchased was bought with stolen labor. My intelligence team at Apex Holdings monitored every single transaction. We tracked the wire transfers, the credit card statements, and the bouncing checks. I watched from my glass tower as they systematically destroyed the very opportunity they had ruined my life to secure. When my parents handed over the cash from their second mortgage, they believed they were providing a temporary bridge loan to a thriving enterprise facing a minor hiccup. They did not realize they were throwing $2 million into a bottomless pit of incompetence and greed. DeAndre did not use the mortgage money to settle the lawsuit or pay the back rent on his warehouses. The moment the funds cleared in the Vanguard Freight corporate account, he immediately wired a massive portion to a luxury car dealership to prevent the repossession of his white Bentley. He then transferred another significant sum to Courtney's personal account so she could maintain her country club membership and host lavish luncheons for her wealthy friends. He genuinely believed that as long as he looked successful, the actual business problems would somehow magically resolve themselves. I sat in my office and reviewed the wire transfer logs that my forensic accountants had legally obtained through our debt acquisition process. It was mesmerizing to witness such pure, unfiltered arrogance. They were dancing on the edge of a cliff, blindfolded and absolutely convinced they could fly. I picked up the physical file containing the deed to my parents' mortgage. The paper felt heavy in my hands. It represented 30 years of my father's hard work, 30 years of my mother's social climbing, and 30 years of conditional love that had finally culminated in this single fragile document. I placed the file in the bottom drawer of my desk and locked it. I did not need to act yet. A good predator does not strike when the prey is merely wounded. A good predator waits until the prey is completely exhausted, out of options, and entirely isolated. I would let DeAndre spend the rest of the mortgage money. I would let Courtney plan her next extravagant party. I would let my parents continue to sit in the front row of the mega church, completely unaware that the very ground beneath their feet now belonged to the daughter they threw away. The bleeding had commenced, and I was perfectly content to sit in the silence and watch them drain themselves dry. The bleeding commenced faster than even my most aggressive financial models had predicted. Vanguard Freight was not just a sinking ship. It was a vessel that had been entirely stripped of its own lifeboats just to pay for my sister-in-law's luxury aesthetic. Operating a commercial logistics company requires massive amounts of liquid capital to cover daily overhead, but DeAndre treated the business like a limitless personal ATM. Diesel fuel costs were skyrocketing, and routine fleet maintenance was absolutely critical to keeping the trucks on the road, but those invoices were being completely ignored. Instead, the operating capital was being funneled directly into Courtney's insatiable desire to portray a life of infinite wealth on social media. My forensic accountants at Apex Holdings tracked every single misappropriated dollar with terrifying clarity. I watched digital reports roll across my desk, detailing how the money meant for warehouse lease payments was being wired to luxury travel agencies. While Vanguard Freight's contracted drivers were sitting stranded on the side of the interstate with blown transmissions because DeAndre had secretly canceled the corporate maintenance plan, Courtney was posting photos from a chartered yacht off the Amalfi Coast. She was drinking vintage champagne and tagging her posts with captions about building an empire and the struggles of being a boss wife. She purchased a collection of $5,000 designer handbags using the exact funds that were supposed to cover the company payroll taxes. My brother was so blinded by his own ego and his desperate need to look successful to his white wife that he simply allowed her to drain the very lifeblood of the company. He genuinely believed that his natural charm and his status as the golden son would somehow magically protect him from the brutal mathematics of corporate insolvency. But mathematics does not care about your church attendance, and it certainly does not care about your ego. The reality of his impending bankruptcy finally began to set in when his suppliers completely cut off his credit lines. Desperate and backed into a corner, DeAndre set his sights on a massive shipping contract with a national retail chain that was looking to outsource its entire southeastern distribution network. It was a $20 million contract that would provide a massive upfront cash mobilization payment. To DeAndre, this contract was his ultimate salvation. It was the magic bullet that would cover his staggering mountain of secret debt, pay off the angry vendors, and hide his blatant embezzlement from the financial regulators. He was so confident he would win the bid that he actually went out and purchased a bespoke $5,000 suit specifically for the pitch meeting, completely ignoring the fact that his warehouse workers had not been paid in 3 weeks. He had absolutely no idea that I was the one waiting for him in the shadows. As the shadow CEO of Apex Holdings, I had my hands in multiple sectors of the commercial supply chain, including a highly efficient, quiet logistics firm called Summit Transport that I had acquired 2 years prior. When I saw the national retail chain issue their request for proposals, I knew immediately that DeAndre would throw everything he had at it. It was too big and too lucrative for him to ignore. What DeAndre did not realize was that his entire operational model was still based on the foundational routing algorithms and pricing structures that I had built for him 5 years ago. The same proprietary data that was stored on the silver flash drive I had slipped into my pocket on the night my parents threw me out into the freezing rain. I did not need to walk into the boardroom to destroy him. True power is orchestrating an execution without ever leaving your desk. I dispatched my senior vice president of acquisitions and the executive team from Summit Transport to intercept the deal. DeAndre went into the pitch meeting at the retail chain's corporate headquarters, armed with nothing but flashy PowerPoint slides, buzzwords about synergy, and his signature arrogant smile. He offered them a pricing structure that looked incredibly attractive on the surface, but was operationally impossible to execute. Immediately after he left the room, my proxy team walked in. They did not use charm or buzzwords. They used raw, undeniable data. Using the exact metrics from the flash drive I had taken, my team projected a terrifyingly accurate map of Vanguard Freight's internal supply chain. They showed the retail executives exactly where DeAndre's routing models would fail. They highlighted his catastrophic deadhead mileage, his unmitigated fuel waste, and his complete lack of emergency fleet contingencies. My team effectively proved that giving Vanguard Freight the contract would result in millions of dollars in delayed shipments and ruined merchandise. We then presented the Summit Transport bid, which offered airtight service-level agreements, severe penalty clauses for late deliveries that DeAndre could never afford to match, and a perfectly optimized route structure. The retail executives were deeply disturbed by the flaws exposed in Vanguard Freight's model and immediately dropped DeAndre from consideration. They signed the exclusive $20 million contract with my company right then and there. DeAndre was absolutely devastated. The rejection letter from the retail chain shattered his final illusion of control, but his ego simply would not allow him to accept that he had failed due to his own profound incompetence. He needed a scapegoat, and the deep-seated entitlement cultivated by our parents provided him with the perfect excuse. This delusion reached its absolute boiling point during our mandatory Sunday family dinner later that week. I attended the dinner sitting quietly at the same polished mahogany table where I had been evicted 5 years prior. The atmosphere in the dining room was suffocatingly tense. My mother had prepared an elaborate meal, but no one was eating. DeAndre was pacing back and forth across the hardwood floor, sweating through his expensive dress shirt and ranting like a madman. He was completely unhinged, delivering a loud, aggressive monologue about how the corporate establishment was inherently racist and designed to keep successful black men from reaching the top. He slammed his fist on the table and claimed that the white executives at the retail chain were intimidated by his brilliance and had deliberately sabotaged his contract to protect the old boys club. It was a pathetic display of victimhood from a man who had squandered millions of dollars on luxury cars and European vacations. My mother sat at the table, nodding along with intense sympathy, murmuring that the world was simply unfair to strong black men. My father, Calvin, looked grim and resolute, completely buying into the narrative that his golden son was being persecuted by an invisible systemic enemy. None of them had the slightest inkling that the invisible enemy who had just orchestrated the block was a 31-year-old black woman sitting quietly at the end of their dinner table eating a piece of roasted chicken. Calvin cleared his throat and demanded the room's attention. He stated that the family needed to close ranks and fight back against the system that was trying to ruin their legacy. He said that Vanguard Freight just needed a small temporary cash bridge to survive until the next big contract came along. He conveniently ignored the fact that he had already secretly mortgaged the very house we were sitting in to provide the last cash bridge, which DeAndre had already squandered. My father turned his gaze directly to me. His eyes were cold and demanding. He told me that he knew I had a corporate job downtown, and that I had likely built up a modest retirement savings account over the past 5 years. He leaned forward and aggressively demanded that I liquidate my entire 401k and transfer the balance to Vanguard Freight immediately. He did not ask me, he commanded me. He said it was my fundamental duty as a member of this family to empty my life savings to support my brother against a system that was trying to destroy him. He told me that my small administrative career was nothing compared to the empire DeAndre was trying to build, and that I needed to make a sacrifice for the greater good of the bloodline. I slowly placed my fork down on the porcelain plate. The sheer audacity of the request was almost breathtaking. 5 years ago, they took my home to fund his vanity project, and now, as his ship was sinking, they wanted me to throw my future into the ocean to serve as his life preserver. I looked at my father, and then I looked at DeAndre, who had stopped pacing and was staring at me with a sickening expression of expectation. He genuinely believed he was entitled to the money I had supposedly worked 5 years to save. Courtney sat next to him, looking bored by the financial discussion while casually scrolling through her phone, likely looking at luxury baby clothes. I picked up my linen napkin and wiped my mouth. I looked directly into my father's eyes and spoke with absolute flat indifference. I told him no. The single syllable hung in the air like a gunshot. My mother gasped, placing her hand over her chest as if she had been physically struck. My father slammed his hand on the table and demanded to know how I could be so incredibly selfish while my brother was facing systemic oppression. I stood up from my chair and pushed it back into place. I told my father that his son was not facing systemic oppression, but was simply facing the consequences of his own profound stupidity. I told them that I would not set myself on fire to keep a parasite warm. DeAndre lunged forward, shouting that I was a jealous, bitter failure who could not stand to see him succeed. I did not raise my voice or react to his aggression. I simply turned around and walked out of the dining room, leaving them to marinate in their own toxic delusions. I walked to my modest car feeling an immense sense of satisfaction knowing that the pressure was finally cracking their foundation. But I also knew the ultimate financial disaster was only hours away because my intelligence team had already intercepted the details of Courtney's plans for the following morning. Despite the fact that Vanguard Freight was literally days away from complete financial ruin and the contracted truck drivers were threatening to protest outside the corporate office due to bounced paychecks, Courtney was living in a completely alternate reality. She was 5 months pregnant and had decided that her social status in the wealthy suburban community required an event of monumental proportions. She had spent the last 3 months planning an outrageously extravagant baby shower at the most exclusive and expensive country club in Atlanta. She had invited over 100 wealthy socialites, churchwives, and local influencers to ensure the event was highly documented on social media. The sheer scale of the waste was staggering. She had commissioned massive walls of imported white roses, custom ice sculptures serving beluga caviar, and personalized champagne bottles with gold leaf labels for every single guest. She had hired a celebrity event planner and a full-string quartet. The total catering and event bill was $50,000. The country club had required a small deposit up front, but the massive remaining balance was due the morning of the event. As I drove back to my downtown apartment, I received a notification from my financial monitoring software. Courtney had no money in her personal accounts because DeAndre had already drained them to pay off emergency personal debts. So in an act of breathtaking criminal entitlement, Courtney had simply taken the Vanguard Freight corporate debit card from DeAndre's wallet. It was the specific card linked directly to the company's primary operating account. The exact same account that was legally designated to hold the payroll funds for the warehouse workers and the contracted drivers. She intended to walk into the country club the next morning and swipe a $50,000 corporate payroll card to pay for her imported roses and caviar, completely indifferent to the fact that dozens of working-class families would not be able to pay their rent because of her baby shower. She thought she was untouchable. She had no idea that I was already planning to attend the shower and I was bringing the matches to light the entire event on fire. The morning of the baby shower arrived with a thick, humid heat that felt entirely appropriate for the absolute suffocation my family was about to experience. Courtney had rented the grand ballroom at the most exclusive country club in the Buckhead district. When I arrived, the sheer audacity of the waste was almost blinding. There were massive arches of imported white roses flanking the entrance. 2 towering ice sculptures carved into the shape of swans slowly melted near a seafood station that was piled high with beluga caviar and fresh lobster. A live string quartet played soft classical music in the corner. It was a grotesque display of artificial royalty funded entirely by unpaid truck drivers and my parents' secret second mortgage. I walked into the ballroom wearing a simple, unbranded charcoal gray suit. It did not scream wealth, but the tailoring was immaculate. My mother Brenda spotted me immediately. She was wearing a massive fascinator hat and a custom silk dress looking exactly like the wealthy matriarch she desperately pretended to be. She rushed over to me and grabbed my arm, her nails digging into my sleeve. She whispered harshly that I needed to stay out of the way and not embarrass them in front of Courtney's high society friends. She told me to go find my seat and stay there until it was time to leave. I found my seat, and the placement was a masterclass in petty humiliation. Courtney had intentionally seated me at a small, wobbly table pushed all the way to the back of the room, right next to the swinging kitchen doors. I was seated with the event staff, the backup photographers, and the valet attendants. I was the sister of the wealthy CEO, and I was placed with the hired help. I sat down calmly and smoothed my napkin over my lap. I watched Courtney floating around the room in a custom maternity gown, laughing loudly and touching her small bump while sipping sparkling cider. A few minutes later, Courtney walked over to my table, trailing 3 of her wealthy white friends behind her. The women were draped in expensive jewelry and carried themselves with that specific type of arrogant entitlement. Courtney stopped in front of my table and smiled a smile that was pure venom wrapped in Southern hospitality. She introduced me to her friends as her husband's little sister, who was still trying to find her footing in the world. One of the women looked at my plain suit and asked what I did for a living. Before I could answer, Courtney placed a manicured hand on her friend's shoulder and laughed. She told them that I was just doing some entry-level office work downtown, but that Vanguard Freight was growing so rapidly, they were thinking of creating a position for me. She looked down at me and said loudly enough for the neighboring tables to hear that since I had no real career prospects, I could be their future nanny. She said it would be a wonderful way to keep the wealth inside the family and give me a sense of purpose since I clearly lacked the ambition to build an empire like DeAndre. Her friends chuckled softly, murmuring about how generous Courtney was to offer charity to her struggling sister-in-law. I looked up at Courtney. I did not scowl or show any signs of anger. I simply offered her a flat corporate smile and thanked her for keeping me in mind for such a crucial operational role. Courtney rolled her eyes at my lack of gratitude and walked away with her friends laughing about how some people just do not understand the mindset required to build generational wealth. I watched her walk over to the main bar where the country club manager was standing with a leather-bound checkbook. It was the catering and venue invoice. I watched Courtney hand him the heavy metal corporate debit card from Vanguard Freight with an arrogant flick of her wrist. The manager took the card and walked back through the swinging kitchen doors right past my table. This was the exact moment the dominoes needed to fall. I stood up and quietly followed the manager into the service hallway just outside the kitchen. He was holding the card and preparing to hand it to his billing assistant. I stepped into his line of sight and politely asked for a moment of his time. He looked annoyed by the interruption from a guest, but I did not flinch. I pulled my digital tablet from my bag and woke the screen. I told him that I was a financial auditor and I strongly advised him to run that specific corporate card right now instead of waiting until the end of the event. He frowned and told me that country club policy was to authorize the card and settle the final bill after the guests departed. I tapped the screen of my tablet and handed it to him. I showed him the public court filings from that very morning. The screen displayed the class action lawsuit from the Vanguard freight truck drivers and the emergency freezing of the company's primary operating accounts. I also showed him the 4 pending lawsuits from other vendors who had been paid with bouncing checks. I looked the manager dead in the eyes and told him that if he waited until the end of the shower to run that card, the $50,000 catering bill would bounce and his staff would not get paid. I told him the accounts were being frozen by a federal judge at noon, and it was currently 11:45. The manager's face went completely pale. He looked at the metal card in his hand and then back at the legal documents on my screen. He did not say a word to me. He just turned around and sprinted into the back office to reach the credit card terminal. I quietly walked back into the ballroom and took my seat by the kitchen doors waiting for the detonation. 15 minutes later, the room was buzzing with the sounds of clinking glasses and wealthy laughter. Courtney was standing at the front of the room holding a microphone preparing to give her speech. DeAndre stood proudly beside her wearing a bespoke linen suit that cost more than a reliable used car. My parents were seated at the grand table of honor beaming with toxic pride. Courtney tapped the microphone and began speaking about the burdens and blessings of building a black empire. She talked about how she and DeAndre were breaking generational curses and establishing a legacy of unlimited wealth for their unborn child. She was actually crying fake tears, wiping her eyes with a lace handkerchief as the crowd murmured in sympathetic awe. Right in the middle of her tearful monologue, the heavy wooden doors of the ballroom swung open. The country club manager marched into the room looking absolutely furious. He did not wait for her to finish speaking. He walked directly up to the front of the room and tapped DeAndre on the shoulder. The manager whispered something into DeAndre's ear. DeAndre's confident smile instantly vanished. He looked at the manager and shook his head, whispering back aggressively. Courtney stopped her speech and lowered the microphone. She asked loudly what the problem was and why the staff was interrupting her special moment. The room went dead silent. Everyone was watching. The manager, clearly having lost all patience with their arrogance, spoke loud enough for the front half of the room to hear. He stated that the corporate card had declined for insufficient funds. Courtney let out a sharp, dramatic gasp. She grabbed the microphone and laughed a high-pitched, nervous sound. She told the room it was just a silly banking error because Vanguard Freight moved millions of dollars a day, and the fraud department must have frozen the card out of caution. She turned to the manager and loudly demanded that he run the backup card she had provided. She told him to stop embarrassing himself and do his job. The manager did not back down. He stood his ground in front of the wealthy crowd and stated clearly that he had already tried the backup personal card. He announced that the backup card had also bounced. He then dropped the ultimate bomb. He informed Courtney that he had contacted the bank directly and was told that the Vanguard Freight payroll account had been frozen due to a court order regarding unpaid wages. The collective gasp from the wealthy socialites in the room was deafening. The illusion of infinite wealth shattered into a million jagged pieces right in front of their eyes. Courtney turned bright red. Her southern hospitality vanished entirely, replacing itself with sheer, unhinged panic. She threw the microphone onto the floor, creating a loud, screeching feedback noise that made people cover their ears. She started screaming at the event staff, calling them incompetent liars, and demanding they fix the machine. When the manager threatened to call security and have the event shut down immediately, Courtney spun around and looked at my father. She yelled across the room, demanding that Calvin give the manager his black card to clear the $50,000 balance. She screamed that the family legacy was being disrespected by the hired help and ordered my father to fix it. Calvin stood up, sweating profusely. He pulled out his leather wallet and handed his premium credit card to the manager with shaking hands. The manager pulled a portable card reader from his jacket pocket right there in the middle of the ballroom. He swiped Calvin's card. The machine beeped a harsh, red error. Declined. My father looked like he was going to have a heart attack. He frantically pulled out another card, his business line of credit. He handed it to the manager. Swipe. Declined. He pulled out a third card. Swipe. Declined. The massive secret second mortgage he had taken out on the family mansion had completely destroyed his credit utilization, and the cash he had given DeAndre was already gone. Calvin had absolutely nothing left to his name. He was standing in front of his entire mega-church community and his wealthy peers, completely exposed as a financial fraud. My mother Brenda put her hands over her face and let out a loud sobbing wail. Her status as the pristine matriarch was disintegrating in real time. The wealthy women who had just been praising Courtney were now picking up their purses and whispering furiously to one another. The judgment in their eyes was absolute. They were witnessing the ultimate social execution. The manager signaled to his staff. The catering crew immediately began taking the plates of food away from the tables. The string quartet stopped playing and started packing up their instruments. They were shutting the entire shower down mid-event. Courtney was weeping hysterically, screaming at DeAndre that he was a useless failure who was humiliating her in front of her friends. DeAndre stood frozen in the center of the room, completely paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of his ruin. He pulled his phone out of his pocket, his hands trembling so violently he almost dropped it. I sat at my table by the kitchen doors, slowly drinking a glass of ice water. I watched DeAndre stare at his phone screen. I knew exactly what he was looking at because I had scheduled the automated message to send the moment the catering cards declined. It was an email from a highly confidential private equity firm called Apex Holdings. The subject line read Emergency Capital Relief Pre-Approved. The email offered a highly predatory fast cash bridge loan of $3 million. It promised immediate wire transfers within 10 minutes to stop any pending collections or embarrassing public defaults. There were no credit checks required. There were no lengthy underwriting processes. All it required was an electronic signature agreeing to put up 51% of Vanguard Freight's voting shares and all of his personal assets as collateral. It was a complete death warrant disguised as a life raft. I watched my brothers sweating and hyperventilating as the caterers wheeled the massive ice swans out of the room. He looked at Courtney, who was threatening to leave him if he did not fix this instantly. He looked at our father, who was slumped in his chair, utterly broken. DeAndre did not read the fine print. He did not call a lawyer. Desperate to save his fragile ego and stop the immediate public humiliation, he tapped the screen of his phone. He clicked agree. The digital agreement on that cell phone screen was merely the appetizer. To finalize the hostile takeover of his crumbling life, DeAndre needed to sign the physical documents in the presence of my legal proxy. I had intentionally selected a man named Richard Sterling to be the face of Apex Holdings for this specific transaction. Richard was a ruthless corporate attorney in his late 50s with cold gray eyes and an impeccably tailored navy suit. I chose him because I knew exactly how my brother operated. DeAndre suffered from a deep-seated need to be validated by older, wealthy white men in the corporate world. He viewed their approval as the ultimate metric of his own success. I knew that if I sent a young black executive or a woman to close the deal, DeAndre's fragile ego would force him to dominate the room, to argue over terms, and to scrutinize every single detail to prove his alpha status. But if I sent an older white man who projected generational wealth and silent authority, DeAndre would immediately shrink into a state of desperate compliance. He would want to impress Richard. He would want to appear as a peer and equal who was far too busy and important to worry about trivial things like reading the fine print. I had spent hours briefing Richard on the exact psychological profile of my brother. I told Richard to wear a vintage Patek Philippe watch and to subtly check it when DeAndre spoke to make him feel rushed and insignificant. The meeting took place less than 24 hours after the disaster at the country club. DeAndre arrived at Richard's downtown office suite wearing another expensive designer suit, desperately trying to project the image of an unfazed shipping magnate. He walked into the boardroom with that manufactured swagger, completely unaware that every hidden camera in the room was feeding a live broadcast directly to my secure laptop 3 floors above them. I watched the entire execution in high definition. Richard played his part with absolute terrifying perfection. He did not offer DeAndre false warmth or eager handshakes. He treated my brother with a clinical, detached respect that immediately triggered DeAndre's deep-seated insecurities. Richard slid the thick stack of legal documents across the massive polished mahogany table. The papers were devastatingly thorough. They explicitly outlined the terms of the $3 million bridge loan. The interest rates were predatory, designed to suffocate any borrower who did not have an airtight repayment strategy. But the most crucial pages were buried deep within the stack. The collateral clauses. In exchange for the immediate cash injection, DeAndre was signing over 51% of Vanguard Freight's voting shares and fully collateralizing the loan against all of his personal assets, including his luxury vehicles and his remaining equity in the business. Richard handed DeAndre a heavy silver pen and suggested that they could wait for Vanguard Freight's legal counsel to review the terms before proceeding. It was a brilliant psychological trap. Richard knew that DeAndre could not afford to pay his current legal team, let alone bring them in for an emergency consultation. More importantly, DeAndre wanted to look like a decisive titan of industry who made multi-million-dollar calls on instinct alone. I watched on the screen as DeAndre scoffed at the suggestion. He leaned back in his leather chair and laughed, waving his hand dismissively. He told Richard that he did not need a team of lawyers to hold his hand through a standard liquidity bridge. He puffed out his chest and bragged that Vanguard Freight was securing national contracts every day and that this $3 million was just pocket change to cover a minor administrative clerical error. Richard simply nodded, his face completely devoid of emotion, and pointed to the signature lines. DeAndre did not read a single paragraph. He did not check the default clauses. He did not review the collateral schedules. He just flipped to the back pages and aggressively signed his name over and over again, driven purely by the desperate need to look successful in front of a white corporate lawyer. With every stroke of that silver pen, he was legally binding his soul to my holding company. Richard gathered the documents, checked the signatures, and pressed a button on his desk phone. Within 60 seconds, $3 million was wired into the Vanguard Freight operating account. DeAndre walked out of that boardroom genuinely believing he had just outsmarted the system. He had absolutely no idea he had just handed me the keys to his entire kingdom. I sat at my desk and monitored the Vanguard Freight corporate accounts, waiting to see what my brother would do with his fresh lifeline. A rational business owner, teetering on the edge of bankruptcy, would have immediately used that $3 million to pay off the angry truck drivers, settle the pending class action lawsuits, and secure the warehouse leases to keep the supply chain moving. But DeAndre was not a rational business owner. He was a narcissistic addict feeding a lifestyle he could not sustain. Less than 2 hours after the Apex Holdings wire transfer cleared, the account alert on my screen flashed. DeAndre had initiated a massive outbound wire. He did not pay a single trucker. He did not pay a single vendor. Instead, he wired a staggering $150,000 directly to a high-end custom jeweler in Buckhead. The memo line on the transfer read, "Push present for Courtney." He was using the emergency corporate bailout funds to buy his wife a massive diamond necklace to pacify her anger over the country club humiliation. He genuinely believed he could just buy her silence and deal with the pesky unpaid drivers later. It was the most spectacular display of financial suicide I had ever witnessed. He had directly violated the explicit terms of the promissory note he had just signed less than 3 hours ago, which clearly stated the funds were strictly for operational business expenses. My forensic accountants immediately flagged the transaction and prepared the legal default notices. The trap had snapped shut with bone-crushing force. The next morning, I was sitting at the small breakfast island in my apartment drinking black coffee and reviewing the legal framework for the upcoming asset seizure. My apartment was a quiet sanctuary of neutral tones and natural light. It smelled of fresh coffee and quiet success. The buzzer to my apartment rang with an aggressive, sustained tone that shattered the peace of the morning. I checked the security monitor and saw my mother Brenda standing in the lobby. She looked frantic, her hair slightly out of place and her designer trench coat hastily tied. She was pacing back and forth, glaring at the security camera. I buzzed her up because I knew this confrontation was inevitable. When I opened my front door, she pushed past me without a greeting or a single moment of hesitation. She brought the frantic, toxic energy of a sinking ship directly into my living room. She paced around my space, looking at my simple furniture with absolute disgust. She spun around and pointed a trembling finger at me. She told me that the family was in a state of absolute crisis, and that it was entirely my fault for bringing bad energy into their lives. She said that DeAndre was under immense pressure from racist corporate entities trying to destroy his business, and that Courtney was so stressed about the country club mix-up that it might harm the baby. My mother marched over to me and pulled a crumpled document from her designer bag. It was a co-signer application for a high-risk personal loan. She shoved the paper into my chest and demanded that I sign it immediately. She told me that since my father was currently dealing with some minor credit issues, it was my duty to leverage my clean credit history to secure a $50,000 personal loan for DeAndre so he could have some walking around money while he restructured his massive shipping empire. I looked at the crumpled application and then up at her panicked face. I asked her if she seriously expected me to take on $50,000 of high-interest personal debt just so Courtney and DeAndre could maintain their fake luxury lifestyle while their business burned to the ground. I reminded her that 5 years ago, she stood in her dining room and told me I was wasting space while she handed my entire life over to a brother who had just proven himself to be a catastrophic failure. My mother closed the distance between us and physically grabbed my arm. Her grip was surprisingly strong, fueled by decades of entitlement and desperation. She dug her acrylic nails into my skin and leaned into my face. Her voice dropped to a vicious, hateful whisper. She told me that I was a selfish, ungrateful child. She said that I had always been the ugly duckling of the family, plain boring and utterly unremarkable. She told me that DeAndre was the swan, the beautiful, brilliant future of our bloodline, and that it was my fundamental duty as the ugly duckling to sacrifice whatever modest resources I had to support the swan. She actually said the words out loud, validating every single terrible thing she had ever made me feel growing up. She truly believed my only purpose on this earth was to serve as a stepping stone for her golden boy. I looked down at her hand gripping my arm. The coldness that washed over me was absolute. All the lingering shadows of my childhood insecurities, all the years of seeking her approval, all the pain of being the discarded daughter, simply evaporated in that singular moment of clarity. She had no power over me anymore. I grabbed her wrist and squeezed it just hard enough to make her gasp and release her grip. I shoved her hand away and stepped back, smoothing the sleeve of my shirt. I looked her dead in the eyes with a terrifying calm. I did not yell or raise my voice. I simply told her that the swan is about to be roasted. My mother stared at me in stunned silence, completely failing to comprehend the magnitude of my warning. She called me a worthless, bitter spinster and stormed out of my apartment, slamming the door so hard the framed pictures on my walls rattled. I did not flinch. I calmly walked back over to the kitchen island and opened my laptop. The screen glowed brightly in the morning light. I pulled up the Apex Holdings executive dashboard and navigated directly to DeAndre's specific loan file. I highlighted the $150,000 jewelry purchase, clearly documenting the gross misappropriation of the emergency business funds. I hovered my cursor over the automated legal action sequence. I took a deep breath of the quiet morning air and pressed down on the trackpad. I triggered the absolute default clause, instantly freezing every single asset DeAndre had left in his name. The digital confirmation flashed across my screen in a sterile green hue, confirming that the financial guillotine had dropped on Vanguard Freight. I sat in the absolute silence of my apartment, watching the cascading effect of the default clause I had just triggered. Within 60 seconds, the automated systems of Apex Holdings seized complete control of every operational account tied to my brother. The $3 million he thought was a lifeline was instantly locked behind legal firewalls. The vanity accounts Courtney used for her country club lunches were frozen solid. The payroll accounts, the vendor lines of credit, the fuel cards, everything went dark. I slowly closed my laptop and took a sip of my coffee, feeling the warmth spread through my chest. I knew that across the city in his fake corporate downtown office, DeAndre was likely staring at a computer screen that was flashing red errors. He was experiencing the exact same helpless freefall he had forced me into 5 years ago when my parents threw me onto the wet pavement. I did not reach out to gloat, because true power resides in the agonizing silence between the strike and the realization. Over the next few days, my forensic accountants provided me with detailed reports of DeAndre's absolute panic. He spent hours on the phone with banking representatives, screaming at customer service agents who had no authority over court-ordered asset forfeiture. He tried to initiate wire transfers from secondary accounts, only to find that my legal proxies had already placed liens on every single dollar that bore his name or his social security number. He was a man drowning in a glass box, while the rest of the world walked by, completely unaware of his suffocation. The beautiful irony was that he could not even turn to my parents for a bailout because my father had already drained every ounce of equity from the family mansion. They were all tied to the same sinking anchor, and the water was rising fast. Despite the catastrophic reality of their financial ruin, my family possessed an absolutely terrifying capacity for delusion. Rather than facing the bankruptcy and liquidating their remaining physical assets to pay the men who drove their trucks, my parents and DeAndre decided to double down on the grand illusion. They believed that if they could just secure one more massive influx of cash from an unsuspecting source, they could magically fix the massive crater in their accounts. Their chosen hunting ground was the annual Generational Wealth Charity Gala hosted at my parents' megachurch. It was an outrageously lavish event designed under the guise of community empowerment, but its true purpose was to allow the wealthy congregation members to flaunt their prosperity and network for private investments. My father, Calvin, had successfully lobbied the church board to position DeAndre as the keynote speaker for the evening. The goal was brutally transparent: DeAndre was going to use the church pulpit to solicit desperate bridge investments from the congregation members, using his fake status as a logistics titan to steal their savings and plug the holes in his sinking ship. The gala was scheduled for a Saturday evening in late August. The church fellowship hall had been completely transformed to resemble an elite downtown ballroom. They had draped the massive walls in heavy black velvet and brought in massive crystal chandeliers that hung from the industrial ceiling. The tables were covered in black silk and decorated with towering centerpieces of white orchids and silver candelabras. The tickets for the event cost $2,000 a plate, and the room was packed with the most affluent members of the local religious community. My mother Brenda had spent the entire week boasting on social media about how her son was going to deliver a speech that would change the economic landscape of the city. She was oblivious to the fact that her son could not even afford the gasoline to drive his rented Bentley back to his leased mansion. I received an invitation to the gala only because my name was still on the church mailing list. In previous years, I would have ignored the expensive envelope and spent the evening reading a book in my quiet apartment. But tonight was different. Tonight was the culmination of half a decade of silent, relentless strategy. I spent the afternoon preparing for the event with the exact same meticulous calculation I applied to corporate mergers. I did not wear my usual modest office attire. I hired a private stylist and commissioned a breathtaking custom-tailored gown that swept the floor in a deep emerald green silk. The dress was entirely unbranded, but the craftsmanship was undeniable. It fit my body with architectural precision, radiating a quiet, dangerous type of wealth that cannot be bought off a department store rack. I paired it with a simple diamond tennis bracelet and a pair of emerald earrings that I had purchased with the profits from my first commercial real estate acquisition. My hair was styled in a sleek, flawless bun, and my makeup was sharp and unreadable. When I looked in the mirror, I did not see the discarded daughter who was told she was wasting space. I saw the shadow CEO of Apex Holdings, the woman who literally owned the paper on their entire existence. I arrived at the church in a sleek black town car, driven by a private chauffeur. The moment I stepped out onto the red carpet that had been laid over the church steps, the atmosphere shifted. The congregation members who usually looked right past me or offered me patronizing smiles of pity stopped their conversations and stared. I walked through the heavy wooden doors of the fellowship hall, and the whispering began instantly. I moved through the crowded room with absolute effortless grace. I did not seek out my parents or my brother. I simply took a glass of sparkling water from a passing waiter and positioned myself near the center of the room, watching the desperate performance unfold around me. My father Calvin was standing near the front stage, shaking hands and laughing loudly with a group of elderly church deacons. His suit looked slightly too tight, and the sweat on his forehead betrayed the immense stress he was hiding. He was pitching his son's brilliance to anyone who would listen, desperately trying to warm up the room for the incoming solicitation. DeAndre was standing near the main bar, looking pale and exhausted despite the heavy layer of expensive cologne he was wearing. His eyes were darting nervously toward the entrance as if he expected the police to walk in at any moment. Courtney was holding court near a massive ice sculpture draped in a loud sequined dress that desperately screamed for attention. She was surrounded by a group of wealthy white wives from the neighboring country club, the same women she had tried to impress at her disastrous baby shower. She spotted me from across the room, and I could see the immediate flash of visceral jealousy contort her features. My presence in that emerald gown completely shattered the narrative she had built about me being a pathetic, struggling spinster. She excused herself from her circle of friends and marched directly toward me, her heels clicking sharply against the polished marble floor. She held a full glass of dark red wine in her right hand, swinging it with an aggressive, intentional rhythm as she closed the distance between us. Courtney stopped inches away from my dress, pretending to stumble slightly on her heels. She tilted her wine glass forward, aiming the dark red liquid directly at the center of my custom silk gown. It was a classic petty maneuver designed to humiliate me and force me to leave the room in shame. But I had spent 5 years anticipating their every move. My reflexes were honed by hundreds of hostile corporate negotiations. Before the wine could even spill over the rim of the glass, I reached out and caught her wrist with absolute paralyzing force. My fingers clamped down on her delicate skin, stopping her momentum completely. The wine sloshed violently inside the glass, but not a single drop touched my dress. Courtney gasped and tried to yank her arm away, but I held her wrist firmly in place. Her wealthy friends had stopped talking and were staring at us with wide eyes. I looked down at her wrist and then up at her face, offering her a cold, terrifyingly polite smile. I spoke in a very clear, steady voice, making sure her friends could hear every single word. I told Courtney that she really needed to be more careful with her balance, especially when she was wearing rented jewelry. Courtney's face drained of all color. She stammered, trying to act offended, and claimed the diamonds were a gift from her incredibly successful husband. I let out a soft, chilling laugh. I told her that the necklace and bracelet she was wearing were part of the weekend bridal package from a specific luxury rental boutique in Buckhead. I recited the exact daily rental rate of $450 out loud. I casually mentioned that the sequined dress she was wearing was pulled from a discount designer outlet over in the next county, and that she had forgotten to cut the red clearance tag off the inside of the hem. The wealthy women behind her covered their mouths in shock, trying to stifle their laughter. Courtney's entire facade of generational wealth crumbled into dust right there on the marble floor. She looked down at the hem of her dress and realized I was absolutely right. The bright red plastic tag was visibly peeking out from the sequined fabric. I slowly released her wrist and stepped back. I told her that it was truly pathetic to watch someone play dress-up with money they did not actually have, especially when their husband's logistics company was currently sitting in default on a $3 million loan. Courtney's eyes widened in absolute terror because she had no idea how I could possibly know the exact dollar amount of the secret predatory loan DeAndre had signed. She backed away from me, stammering incoherently, and practically ran toward the restrooms to hide her humiliation. I smoothed the silk of my dress and turned my attention back to the main stage. The church lights dimmed, and a spotlight illuminated the podium. The pastor took the microphone and delivered a booming, passionate introduction for the keynote speaker of the evening. He spoke about DeAndre as a shining beacon of entrepreneurial success, a man who had conquered the corporate world and was now returning to share his infinite wisdom with his community. The congregation erupted in thunderous applause as DeAndre walked up the steps to the stage. He looked physically ill. His skin had a gray, sickly undertone, and his hands were shaking as he gripped the edges of the wooden podium. He forced a wide, stiff smile and began his speech. DeAndre started talking about the principles of financial literacy and the importance of investing in Black-owned businesses. The hypocrisy was so thick it was almost suffocating. Here was a man who had stolen my condo, drained my parents' retirement, and defaulted on millions of dollars in corporate debt, standing in front of a church preaching about fiscal responsibility. He began to pivot his speech toward the pitch, telling the congregation that Vanguard Freight was launching a special community investment initiative. He promised guaranteed massive returns for any church member who was willing to pledge a minimum of $10,000 to his company tonight. He was literally begging them to hand over their hard-earned savings so he could pay off the predatory loan he had signed with my company. My father stood in the front row, nodding aggressively and shouting words of encouragement, trying to hype up the crowd to open their wallets. The congregation was listening intently, completely captivated by the illusion of his success. And then the heavy, solid oak doors at the back of the fellowship hall swung wide open with a loud, echoing crack. The entire room turned around in their seats to see what had caused the disruption. Two massive, broad-shouldered men walked into the church. They were not wearing formal attire. They wore heavy work boots, dark tactical pants, and black polo shirts with official-looking badges clipped to their belts. They were asset recovery agents, operating under the strict legal directives of Apex Holdings. They did not care about the church service or the wealthy attendees. They operated with the blunt force trauma of the legal system. The two men walked directly down the center aisle of the ballroom, their heavy boots thudding against the polished floor. The string quartet abruptly stopped playing. The silence in the room was absolute and terrifying. DeAndre stopped speaking mid-sentence, his mouth hanging open as he stared at the men approaching the stage. My father stepped into the aisle trying to block their path, demanding to know who they were and how dare they interrupt a sacred church event. The lead recovery agent did not even slow down. He simply sidestepped my father and pulled a thick stack of legal documents from his clipboard. The agent reached the front of the stage and looked directly up at DeAndre. He spoke in a loud, booming voice that echoed through the silent, cavernous room. He announced that they were executing a court-ordered asset forfeiture due to a massive breach of contract and severe financial default. He stated clearly for the entire congregation to hear that they had already secured the white Bentley from the church parking lot, and it was currently being loaded onto a flatbed tow truck outside. The collective gasp from the hundreds of church members was deafening. The illusion of the golden child shattered violently in front of their very eyes. The wealthy deacons who had been praising DeAndre just moments ago were now whispering in shock and disgust. But the agent was not finished. He looked at DeAndre's wrist. He pointed a thick, calloused finger at the heavy gold watch gleaming under the stage lights. He announced that the forfeiture order included all luxury personal assets listed under the collateral schedule. He demanded that DeAndre hand over the gold Rolex immediately. The humiliation was absolute. DeAndre stood frozen behind the podium, tears welling in his eyes. His entire identity, his entire sense of worth was tied to that watch and that car. My father Calvin let out a strangled, gasping sound. His chest heaved as the reality of his own impending ruin crashed down upon him. He clutched his chest and collapsed backward, fainting completely and tumbling into a row of folding chairs. Several church members rushed to help him, but the repo men did not even blink. Courtney burst out from the back hallway, having heard the commotion. She ran down the aisle, her rented sequined dress shimmering under the lights. She threw herself between the stage and the repo men, screaming at the top of her lungs. She shrieked that they were making a mistake, that they were wealthy socialites, and that they could not be treated like common criminals. She yelled that Vanguard Freight was a multi-million-dollar empire and that her husband was a corporate titan. She demanded that they leave immediately because they were wealthy and untouchable. The lead agent looked at her with pure, unadulterated pity. He calmly informed her that Vanguard Freight had exactly $0 in its operating accounts and that they were legally seizing the assets to satisfy a predatory loan default. DeAndre slowly unclasped the gold Rolex from his wrist with shaking fingers. He handed it down to the agent looking like a completely broken man. His spirit was entirely crushed. The agent took the watch, placed it into a secure evidence bag, and then handed DeAndre the physical copy of the asset forfeiture order. He told DeAndre that he had been officially served. DeAndre took the heavy stack of papers. He looked down at the bold black lettering printed across the top of the legal document. I stood perfectly still in my emerald green gown, watching the exact moment his eyes read the letterhead. I watched his entire world stop spinning as he saw the name of the shadow corporation that had just legally dismantled his life. The letterhead read, Apex Holdings. The drive from the church to my parents' $2 million estate was an exercise in absolute suffocating silence. I rode in the back of my private town car, watching the city lights blur past the tinted windows. My family had been forced to order a standard rideshare vehicle because DeAndre's luxury white Bentley was currently sitting on the back of a flatbed tow truck heading to a repossession lot. When we finally arrived and gathered in the grand living room of their sprawling suburban mansion, the atmosphere was incredibly toxic. The pristine white walls, the imported Italian leather sofas, and the massive crystal chandeliers seemed to openly mock the absolute financial devastation that had just occurred. They were standing inside a museum dedicated to a wealth that no longer existed. DeAndre was pacing the entire length of the massive room, hyperventilating. His breathing was shallow and erratic. His hands were trembling so violently he could barely hold the heavy crystal glass of expensive bourbon he had frantically poured for himself. His bespoke linen suit, the one he had bought specifically to impress the retail executives he failed to win over, was now heavily wrinkled and stained with nervous sweat. He kept pacing back and forth, muttering to himself that there had to be a mistake. He ranted that the banking system was inherently rigged against him, and that Apex Holdings was just some illegal predatory firm trying to steal his legitimate empire. Courtney was curled up on one of the white leather sofas, sobbing hysterically into a decorative silk throw pillow. She was aggressively mourning the loss of her rented diamonds and her completely shattered social status. She was no longer the untouchable boss wife of a logistics titan. She was a public laughingstock who had just watched her credit cards decline in front of the wealthiest women in Atlanta. My mother, Brenda, was pacing in the exact opposite direction of my brother. She was not concerned about the unpaid truck drivers who were losing their livelihoods. She was not worried about the legal ramifications of a massive commercial loan default. She was exclusively panicking about losing her elite status in the megachurch hierarchy. She kept agonizing aloud over what the pastor's wife would think and how she could never possibly show her face at the ladies' auxiliary luncheon ever again. The sheer vanity of her panic was astounding. Suddenly, my mother stopped pacing. She locked her furious eyes directly on me. I was still standing near the arched entryway of the living room, still wearing my custom-tailored emerald green gown, silently watching the wreckage of their lives unfold. Brenda marched over to me, her face tight with a desperate, deeply ingrained entitlement. She told me that the family needed to weather this temporary storm, and that we all needed to make sacrifices. She declared that DeAndre and Courtney needed a quiet, safe place to escape the aggressive local media and the circling creditors. Without an ounce of hesitation or a single polite request, she ordered me to hand over the keys to my downtown apartment. She told me that I needed to pack a bag and go stay with a friend because my brother and his pregnant wife were moving into my space until the legal dust settled. Before I could even process the sheer audacity of my mother's demand, Courtney lifted her head from the tear-stained silk pillow. Her face was red and blotchy, and her expensive makeup was completely ruined, running down her cheeks in dark streaks. But despite her absolute public humiliation, her core entitlement was still entirely intact. She sniffled loudly, wiped her nose, and told me that I did not necessarily have to leave the apartment. She looked at me with a sickeningly condescending pout and said, "Yes, Alana, you can sleep on the sofa, I'm pregnant. I need the master bedroom. It's the least you can do after ruining the gala with your bad energy." She honestly believed that my mere presence at the church had somehow miraculously manifested the repo men. She thought that because I did not stand up and clap for DeAndre during his ridiculous speech, I had actively cursed his business. The delusion was so profound it was almost clinical. My mother, emboldened by Courtney's absurd statement, took a step closer to me. Brenda physically grabbed my arm, her fingers digging sharply into my skin just below the sleeve of my gown. She leaned in close and told me it was my duty as the ugly duckling of the family to support the swan. She said that I had always been plain and practical and that I existed solely to serve as a foundation for DeAndre's brilliance. I looked at her hand gripping my arm. I looked at Courtney sitting on the sofa in her cheap discount dress. I looked at my father, Calvin, who was sitting silently in a high-backed chair, staring blankly at the floor like a broken man. And then I laughed. It was not a polite chuckle. It was a deep, resonant, genuine laugh that echoed off the vaulted ceilings of the mansion. My mother gasped, stepping back and looking genuinely offended by my joy. Courtney demanded to know what was so funny. I stopped laughing and physically shook my mother's hand off my arm. I smoothed the fabric of my dress and looked her dead in the eyes. I stated very clearly, the swan is about to be roasted. I walked slowly to the center of the living room, commanding the space with absolute authority. I told my mother that neither DeAndre nor Courtney would ever be stepping foot inside my apartment. I told her that the supposed bad energy in the room had absolutely nothing to do with me and everything to do with the fact that her golden son was a catastrophic fraud. Brenda shrieked, demanding that I respect my brother and his empire. I ignored her completely and turned my attention to Calvin. I asked my father if he wanted to explain to his wife exactly how broke they truly were or if he wanted me to do the honors. Calvin physically flinched, his eyes darting wildly toward Brenda. He opened his mouth, but his throat was so dry no sound came out. He just shook his head in a pathetic silent plea. I smiled with a cold surgical precision and decided to pull the pin on the grenade myself. I turned back to my mother and spoke with absolute mathematical clarity. I told her that Vanguard Freight had exactly $0 in its operating accounts. I explained that DeAndre had recently secured a massive predatory cash injection to save his company, but instead of paying his starving logistics vendors or his furious truckers, he had spent the last bit of working capital buying Courtney a new diamond push present. I watched Courtney's hand instinctively fly to her bare neck where her rented jewelry had been just hours before. Then I delivered the final fatal blow. I looked my mother directly in the eyes and informed her that my father had recently taken out a secret second mortgage on this very mansion. I recited the exact dollar amount of $2,450,000. I told her that Calvin had handed every single penny of their deeply leveraged home equity to DeAndre, and that DeAndre had completely blown it all in less than a month. I explained that their home no longer belonged to them. The silence that followed was absolute. It was a heavy, suffocating vacuum that sucked all the remaining oxygen out of the room. My mother slowly turned her head to look at my father. Her face had drained of all color, leaving her looking hollow and aged. She asked him in a shaky, breathless whisper if what I was saying was true. Calvin could not even look his wife in the eye. He buried his face in his trembling hands and let out a pathetic, whimpering sob. The pristine illusion of their perfect, wealthy life shattered completely and violently. Brenda let out a loud, blood-curdling scream. She flew across the room and started hitting Calvin on the shoulders and chest, shrieking that he had gambled their home away behind her back. She screamed that he had completely ruined her, that she would be a laughingstock in their social circles, and that they were going to be homeless. She did not care that he had done it out of a misguided love for DeAndre. She only cared that her massive physical symbol of wealth was gone. The family instantly turned on each other like starved wolves in a cage. DeAndre stopped pacing and started yelling at Calvin, blaming his father for not securing a larger loan to properly sustain his genius vision. Courtney started screaming at DeAndre for lying to her about his actual net worth and subjecting her to public humiliation. Calvin was crying loudly, trying to shield his face from my mother's frantic fists, while shouting that he only did what she had always wanted him to do for their son. It was a complete and utter meltdown of a deeply toxic ecosystem. I stood perfectly still in my emerald gown and watched their empire burn to ash. I did not feel an ounce of pity. I felt the quiet, immense satisfaction of a long overdue correction. Just as the screaming reached a deafening fever pitch, the heavy brass knocker on the front door echoed sharply through the foyer. The sudden harsh noise startled everyone into an immediate breathless silence. Brenda quickly smoothed her hair and frantically wiped her tear-streaked face, desperately trying to assemble some fragmented piece of her shattered dignity. She walked to the entryway and opened the heavy wooden door to find a late-night legal courier standing on the porch. The courier held a clipboard and asked directly for DeAndre. My brother walked to the door, his posture defensive and arrogant. The courier handed over a thick, heavily sealed package, required a signature, and immediately walked away into the dark. DeAndre snatched the package, his hands shaking violently, once again as he tore the thick cardboard envelope open. He pulled out a stack of crisp, white legal documents. I watched his eyes frantically scan the text on the very first page. It was a formal notice of a hostile takeover. The letter explicitly stated that due to extreme financial negligence, the total misappropriation of corporate funds, and a catastrophic breach of contract, The board of directors at Apex Holdings had legally assumed total voting control of Vanguard Freight. The document triggered the immediate default clause on his predatory loan. It demanded DeAndre's mandatory attendance at an emergency board meeting the following morning, where the CEO of Apex Holdings would officially liquidate his company and strip him of all remaining assets. DeAndre's face twisted from pale fear into a mask of pure, desperate rage. He crushed the thick legal paper in his fist, crumpling the pristine document. He looked around at the weeping, miserable wreckage of his family in the living room, and his toxic ego flared up one final time. He declared loudly to the room that he was absolutely not going down without a fight. He puffed out his chest and swore that the system was not going to defeat him. He proudly announced that he was going to walk directly into that boardroom tomorrow morning, look this cowardly phantom CEO in the eye, and completely intimidate them into backing down. He promised his crying wife and his ruined parents that he would force Apex Holdings to renegotiate the terms and save his logistics empire through sheer force of will. Let me take a moment to dissect the sheer anatomy of their panic, because it was truly a masterpiece of generational dysfunction. My mother Brenda's entire existence was predicated on the perception of her peers. She had spent decades cultivating the image of the flawless matriarch who had successfully raised the next great black capitalist. Her terror was not rooted in the impending reality of poverty, but rather in the unbearable thought of being perceived as ordinary. She had weaponized her son's supposed success to belittle her friends and assert dominance in the church auxiliary board. The knowledge that Calvin had secretly mortgaged the mansion meant that the very walls she used to project her superiority were now owned by the bank. As she beat her fists against my father's chest, she was not mourning the loss of shelter, she was mourning the death of her own vanity. Calvin, on the other hand, was experiencing the catastrophic collapse of his own patriarchal ego. He had always believed that throwing money at DeAndre was a substitute for actual fatherhood and moral guidance. He had co-signed DeAndre's arrogance, enabled his incompetence, and ultimately sacrificed his own financial security on the altar of his son's narcissism. Sitting in that high-backed chair, sobbing into his hands, Calvin finally realized that he had spent his entire life building a monument on quicksand. He had traded the daughter who actually possessed his work ethic for the son who only possessed his last name. And then there was Courtney. Her reaction was perhaps the most purely transactional. She had married DeAndre for the aesthetic of wealth. She wanted the title of a CEO wife, the country club memberships, and the designer maternity shoots. The realization that her husband was not a titan of industry, but a staggering liability completely broke her programming. She screamed at DeAndre with a vitriol that exposed the absolute lack of any genuine affection between them. She demanded to know how she was supposed to afford her upcoming prenatal retreats and her imported nursery furniture. She was entirely unconcerned about the warehouse workers whose paychecks she had effectively stolen to fund her baby shower. Her universe began and ended with her own comfort. As I walked down the long paved driveway toward my waiting car, I could still hear their muffled shouts echoing through the thick wooden doors of the mansion. The sound was like music. I had not raised my voice once. I had not thrown a tantrum. I had simply held up a mirror and allowed them to destroy themselves with their own reflections. I slid into the back seat of the town car and instructed my driver to take me back to the city. Tomorrow morning was going to be the most important meeting of my professional career. DeAndre believed he was going to walk into a corporate boardroom and intimidate a faceless white executive. He believed he could use his loud charm and aggressive posturing to bully his way out of a legally binding contract. He had absolutely no idea that the phantom CEO of Apex Holdings, the ruthless entity that now owned every single asset he had ever possessed, was the very sister he had discarded like trash. I looked out the window at the passing streetlights and smiled. The trap had perfectly snapped shut, and tomorrow I was finally going to show him exactly who was holding the pen. The morning sun reflected off the glass facade of the Apex Holdings Tower, casting long, sharp shadows across the downtown pavement. I arrived at the penthouse suite 2 hours before the scheduled emergency meeting to ensure every single detail was executed with absolute surgical precision. The main boardroom was a masterpiece of corporate intimidation. It was a vast cavernous space enclosed by floor-to-ceiling soundproof glass, offering a commanding panoramic view of the city skyline. In the center of the room sat a custom-built black walnut conference table that cost over $100,000. The chairs were imported black leather, and the lighting was stark and unyielding. Richard Sterling, my proxy attorney, stood quietly by the window, reviewing the final liquidation schedules. I took my seat at the absolute head of the heavy wooden table, resting my hands on the cool, polished surface. The trap was set, and I was simply waiting for the prey to walk through the door. At exactly 9 o'clock, the private elevator chimed. I watched the internal security feed on my tablet as the heavy frosted glass doors parted in the reception area. DeAndre stepped out first, with our father, Calvin, trailing closely behind him. They had brought along a cheap strip mall attorney who looked completely terrified by the sheer scale and wealth of the Apex Holdings penthouse. The lawyer was sweating, clutching a thin briefcase and constantly adjusting his cheap tie. DeAndre, on the other hand, was actively trying to project a massive aura of manufactured dominance. He was wearing a flashy maroon designer suit, his chest puffed out in a desperate display of fake alpha energy. He was aggressively adjusting his cuffs and whispering to Calvin, telling him to stay quiet and let him handle the negotiation. DeAndre genuinely believed he was about to walk into this room and bully some faceless white corporate suit into backing down. His toxic ego had convinced him that his sheer charisma could override a legally binding asset forfeiture. The receptionist led them down the long corridor and pushed open the heavy oak doors to the main boardroom. DeAndre marched in with his chin raised high, preparing to unleash his aggressive posturing onto whoever was sitting across from him. He stopped dead in his tracks the moment he saw me. I was sitting perfectly still at the head of the massive table wearing an immaculate charcoal suit. Richard Sterling stood obediently just over my right shoulder, holding a thick leather portfolio. DeAndre blinked several times, his brain completely short-circuiting as his eyes darted from me to Richard and back again. His deeply ingrained delusions simply could not process the visual data in front of him. Slowly, a confused, arrogant smirk began to spread across his face. He let out a loud, obnoxious laugh that echoed harshly against the glass walls of the boardroom. He looked directly at Richard and scoffed, asking the older white attorney why his little sister was sitting in the executive's chair. He actually clapped his hands together and rudely told me to get up and go fetch some coffee for the men while they discussed real business. He assumed Richard had brought me in as a temp or a secretary to take meeting minutes. He told Richard that it was a cute and funny coincidence that they had hired his plain sister, but he was a very busy man and he needed to speak to the phantom CEO who was hiding behind all this aggressive paperwork. DeAndre slammed his hands down on the polished walnut table, leaning forward and demanding that the real boss show their face immediately so they could sort out this ridiculous clerical error. Richard did not say a single word. He did not even blink. He simply placed the heavy leather portfolio on the table directly in front of me and took a respectful step back, deferring completely to my authority. I slowly unclasped the portfolio and pulled out the 51% majority shareholder documents. The paper was thick and undeniable, bearing the official corporate seals. I slid the pristine white pages across the long, polished wood, watching them glide perfectly until they stopped right at the edge of the table where DeAndre was standing. I looked up at him, my face completely devoid of any emotion. I spoke in a calm, chillingly steady voice that cut through the silence of the room. I told him that I am the CEO, DeAndre, and as the majority shareholder, my first act is firing you. The smug, arrogant smile vanished from DeAndre's face, as if it had been wiped away by a physical blow. The color completely drained from his cheeks, leaving his skin a sickly pale gray. His eyes darted frantically from the legal documents to my face, and then to Richard, who simply nodded to confirm my absolute ultimate authority. DeAndre's mouth opened, but no sound came out. He looked down at the signature he had hastily scribbled just a few days ago, legally binding his soul and his entire company to my corporate entity. He was entirely paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of his own catastrophic stupidity. I did not give him a single moment to recover or formulate a defense. I opened the massive forensic audit file and began to coldly dissect the decaying corpse of his fake empire. I read out loud the exact staggering dollar amounts he had embezzled from his own operational accounts. I listed the $60,000 he had illegally diverted from the commercial fuel budget to pay for Courtney's leased luxury SUVs. I detailed the $85,000 he had brazenly stolen from the warehouse workers' payroll fund to cover the down payment on the country club baby shower. I exposed the network of phantom vendor accounts he had created to secretly funnel cash directly into his personal crypto wallets, while his truck drivers faced eviction and his freight contracts bounced. I dismantled his entire existence, piece by specific piece, exposing him not as a brilliant logistics titan, but as a pathetic common thief playing dress-up with other people's money. I laid out the brutal, undeniable facts of his complete and utter incompetence. Calvin stepped forward, his face flushed with a desperate, panicked rage. His fragile patriarchal ego could not handle the sight of his golden son being systematically destroyed by the daughter he had always deemed worthless and plain. Calvin slammed his fist on the table, trying to summon his booming megachurch voice, the voice he used to command respect from his congregation. He commanded me to stop this ridiculous, disrespectful nonsense immediately. He ordered me to tear up the documents and surrender the company back to my brother out of respect for the family legacy. He pointed a shaking finger at my face and demanded that I submit to his authority out of respect for the patriarch. He tried to shame me, saying that a good, loyal daughter would never publicly humiliate her own bloodline and that I owed them my complete and absolute obedience. He demanded that I fix the situation right now because DeAndre was the true heir to the family name. I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice. I remained seated at the head of the $100,000 table, looking at my father with absolute pity. I calmly reached back into the leather portfolio and pulled out a secondary file marked with a bright red tab. I slid the red folder across the long table directly toward my father. Calvin looked down at the bright red cover, his hands trembling violently as he opened it. I told him he was looking at a verified forensic audit, detailing multiple counts of federal wire fraud and systemic tax evasion committed by DeAndre across 3 different state lines. I explained the severe criminal liability attached to those specific transactions. The cheap strip mall lawyer leaned over my father's shoulder to read the documents, and the color instantly vanished from his face. The lawyer stepped back, putting immediate physical distance between himself and my family, whispering frantically that these were serious federal charges, and he could not represent them in a criminal racketeering case. I looked at Calvin, who was gripping the edge of the table as if the floor was collapsing beneath him. His breathing was shallow, and his eyes were wide with pure, unadulterated terror. I told my father that he had exactly 2 options. I said, "You can walk away empty-handed right now, or I can pick up this phone and call the FBI to have your golden boy dragged out of this building in handcuffs." I leaned forward, resting my hands on the black walnut table, letting the silence stretch out and suffocate them. Choose patriarch. The air in the boardroom was completely dead. Calvin stared at the wire fraud evidence and then looked at his favorite son. The realization finally crashed down upon him that there was no church offering large enough, no prayer desperate enough to buy their way out of a federal indictment. The cheap lawyer did not wait for a response. He grabbed his briefcase, mumbled a panicked string of apologies, and practically sprinted out of the boardroom, leaving my family entirely defenseless and exposed. Calvin dropped the red folder onto the table, his shoulders slumping heavily as the last ounce of his manufactured authority completely evaporated into the sterile air. He was completely broken, a shattered man staring at the ruins of his own toxic favoritism. He grabbed DeAndre's arm, pulling his paralyzed son toward the door. DeAndre was a hollow, empty shell. His eyes were glazed over, and his breath was coming in short, jagged, gasping wheezes. He stumbled backward away from the table, unable to look me in the eye, entirely destroyed by the reality of his own ruin. They retreated to the elevator in absolute silent defeat. The heavy oak doors closed behind them, leaving me alone in the quiet, immaculate penthouse suite, holding the keys to the kingdom. DeAndre stumbled out of the Apex Holdings tower and into the blistering morning heat of the city. His mind was a chaotic, terrifying blur of sheer panic and pure survival instinct. He was completely ruined. He had no company, no money, no cars, and a federal prison sentence hanging over his head by a single invisible thread controlled entirely by the sister he had spent his whole life despising. He managed to flag down a passing taxi, throwing himself into the back seat and screaming at the driver to speed back to his rented suburban mansion. He was hyperventilating, his heart hammering wildly against his ribs as he stared out the window. He needed to get back to Courtney. He needed to tell his pregnant wife that the grand illusion was over and that they had to pack whatever they could carry and flee the state before I changed my mind and called the federal authorities to lock him in a cage. He desperately planned to drain whatever small amounts of cash she might have hidden in her personal accounts and just drive through the night. The taxi screeched to a halt in the circular driveway of the massive quiet estate. DeAndre threw a crumpled bill at the driver and sprinted up the brick steps, taking them two at a time. He pushed open the heavy double front doors, shouting Courtney's name, desperately calling for her to hurry and grab her things. He ran into the grand foyer and stopped dead in his tracks, entirely frozen by the scene unfolding in front of him. The polished marble floor of the entryway was completely covered with expensive designer luggage. Courtney was standing in the center of the room, wearing her most expensive coat, furiously zipping up the last of her heavy leather travel bags. DeAndre stood paralyzed in the foyer of the mansion, watching his wife pack the last of her belongings into her monogrammed leather travel bags. He stumbled forward, begging her to stop, promising her that he could fix this, and that he just needed a little more time to outsmart the system. Courtney did not even look up from the brass zipper. She calmly locked her suitcase and turned to face him with an expression of absolute disgust. She told him very clearly that she had married a CEO, not a pathetic felon who was about to go to federal prison and live with his parents. She stated that her entire brand was built on generational wealth, and she refused to ruin her aesthetic by playing the supportive wife to a bankrupt fraud. DeAndre fell to his knees, actually grabbing the hem of her expensive coat, crying and pleading with her to stay for the sake of their unborn child. Courtney coldly stepped back and pulled her coat out of his grip. She looked down at him and delivered her final blow. She informed him that she had spent the entire morning legally transferring every single remaining dollar from their joint personal checking and savings accounts into an offshore trust in her mother's name. She had completely drained whatever pathetic scraps of cash he thought he had left to fund their escape. Through the open front doors, a black Uber pulled up to the driveway. Courtney signaled the driver to grab her bags. She did not shed a single tear or offer a final goodbye. She simply turned on her heel and walked out of the mansion, leaving DeAndre sobbing on the marble floor alone and completely destitute. While DeAndre was weeping in the foyer, my parents were experiencing their own brutal public execution across town. The news of the repossession at the charity gala had spread through the mega-church congregation like a wildfire. By Sunday morning, the entire religious community knew the truth about Vanguard Freight and the fake empire my father had been soliciting investments for. Calvin and Brenda arrived at the church for the morning service, desperately trying to pretend that the repo men had just been a massive misunderstanding. But the moment they walked into the grand sanctuary, the social isolation was immediate and absolute. The wealthy deacons who normally greeted my father with firm handshakes and wide smiles physically turned their backs and walked the other way. The women in the auxiliary board, who usually flocked to my mother, completely ignored her presence. The pastor took to the pulpit and delivered a scathing sermon about the sins of pride, deceit, and the toxic worship of false idols. He did not use their names, but he explicitly stated that the church board was launching an internal investigation into the financial solicitations that occurred at the gala and that they were formally distancing the congregation from any individuals involved in fraudulent business practices. Brenda sat in her usual front row pew, completely frozen as her entire social identity was systematically dismantled from the pulpit. Her status as the pristine first lady of the congregation, the wealthy matriarch she had sacrificed my sanity to become, was gone forever. After the service, her wealthy friends scurried to their luxury cars, refusing to even make eye contact with her. She was completely shunned, isolated in a church parking lot, surrounded by the devastating reality of her own shallow existence. The situation inside the mansion deteriorated into absolute chaos by Monday morning. They had no cars because the luxury leases had been terminated. They had no cash because Courtney had taken the last of it. And then the final consequence of my father's secret second mortgage arrived. A county sheriff knocked on the heavy wooden doors and handed Calvin a formal notice of eviction. The bank had officially foreclosed on the property, and they were given exactly 48 hours to vacate the premises before the locks would be changed and their remaining possessions seized. The house echoed with the sounds of screaming and profound despair. Brenda wept hysterically, wandering through the empty halls, mourning her lost status, while Calvin sat in the dark, completely paralyzed by his failure. DeAndre was locked in his childhood bedroom, refusing to speak to anyone, hiding from the reality of his impending federal indictment. They were entirely trapped in a nightmare of their own making, but my father's toxic delusions simply refused to die. He could not accept that he had been outplayed. He convinced himself that there had to be some sort of loophole, some way to negotiate a grace period. Calvin spent hours digging through the foreclosure paperwork, desperately searching for a lifeline. He found a document stating that the foreclosed debt had been purchased by an anonymous private buyer through an external trust. My father, in a final act of pure, unadulterated entitlement, decided that he could simply track down this anonymous buyer and beg for mercy. He genuinely believed that if he could just look this investor in the eye and explain his legacy, they would miraculously forgive the debt and give him his mansion back. He spent his last few dollars renting a beat-up U-Haul truck, since it was the only vehicle they could afford to transport their immediate belongings. The three of them piled into the cramped cab of the truck, sweaty, exhausted, and completely broken. Calvin, gripping the steering wheel, navigated the heavy vehicle out of their suburban neighborhood, following the address he had pulled from the property records. They drove for hours, leaving the familiar wealthy suburbs and heading straight toward the coast. They eventually arrived at an ultra-exclusive beachfront enclave, a gated community of private estates that required high-level security clearance just to approach the main road. They sat in their rented U-Haul, staring at the massive wrought iron gates, completely unaware of who was waiting for them on the other side. The rented U-Haul idled loudly in front of the towering wrought iron gates of the exclusive beachfront enclave. The engine sputtered and choked violently, spitting a thick cloud of dark gray exhaust into the pristine, salty ocean air. Calvin sat behind the steering wheel, his hands gripping the cracked plastic so tightly his knuckles were completely white. He rolled down the manual window and leaned out, pressing the glowing silver button on the high-tech security intercom. He cleared his dry throat, trying to summon whatever tiny fragment of authority he had left. He demanded to speak to the owner of the property, stating that he was Calvin Wilson, and he was here to negotiate the release of his foreclosed family estate. The intercom crackled with a sharp burst of static before a cold, automated voice simply instructed them to wait. For a few agonizing minutes, the three of them sat trapped inside the suffocating cramped cab of the moving truck. The air conditioning was broken, and the cabin smelled overwhelmingly of stale sweat, cheap vinyl, and the unmistakable metallic scent of pure panic. Brenda was furiously blotting her sweaty face with a crumpled tissue, muttering to herself that this anonymous buyer would surely understand their plight once she explained who they were in the social hierarchy. DeAndre was crammed against the passenger door, staring blankly at the dashboard, his eyes red and hollow. Suddenly, the massive iron gates began to emit a low mechanical hum. They slowly parted, sliding smoothly along their hidden tracks, revealing a breathtaking property that looked like it belonged on the cover of an elite architectural magazine. The driveway was impossibly long, paved with pristine crushed white stone and lined with perfectly manicured imported palm trees. At the end of the driveway, sitting majestically against the backdrop of the crashing Pacific Ocean, was a $20 million modern villa. It was a staggering masterpiece of sleek steel geometric concrete and massive floor-to-ceiling glass panels that reflected the glaring afternoon sun. It was a fortress of absolute untouchable wealth. Calvin slowly took his foot off the brake, letting the heavy, grimy truck roll forward onto the pristine white stones. The sound of the tires crunching against the gravel felt loud and offensive in the quiet luxury of the enclave. They parked the truck near the base of the grand entryway and stepped out into the bright sunlight. The contrast was almost painful to look at. There they were, three broken, financially ruined people, standing in front of a monument to success they could not even begin to comprehend. The heavy glass front door of the villa glided open. Calvin, Brenda, and DeAndre froze in place, staring up at the entrance, expecting to see a ruthless, older white billionaire step out to greet them. Instead, the person who walked out into the sunlight completely shattered their reality. It was me. I walked slowly down the floating concrete steps of my home, moving with the effortless grace of someone who holds absolute power. I was wearing a flowing silk lounge set in a deep oceanic blue, and my bare feet were stepping lightly against the warm stone. In my right hand, I held a delicate crystal glass filled with a very expensive vintage red wine. I was completely relaxed, completely at peace, and entirely in control. Flanking me on either side were two massive, heavily armed private security contractors wearing dark suits and earpieces, their eyes scanning the three intruders with cold professional detachment. I stopped a few yards away from the front bumper of their rented moving truck and took a slow, deliberate sip of my wine. I looked at the three of them, letting the silence stretch out and wrap around their throats. Calvin physically staggered backward, as if he had been struck by lightning. He leaned heavily against the dirty hood of the U-Haul, his mouth opening and closing soundlessly. Brenda's jaw dropped so far it almost unhinged. The crumpled tissue slipped from her fingers and fluttered to the ground. She stared at my silk clothes, at the armed guards, and at the massive $20 million glass mansion behind me. Her brain simply could not process the visual data. It violated every single law of the toxic universe she had built. But it was DeAndre whose reaction was the most visceral. The sight of me standing there holding a glass of wine in front of an estate that dwarfed anything he had ever dreamed of owning completely broke his fragile, fractured mind. The heavy iron gates of reality violently slammed shut on his delusions. DeAndre let out a loud, guttural sound that was half scream and half sob. His knees buckled and he collapsed right there on the crushed white stone, holding his head in his hands. His flashy maroon designer suit, the same one he had worn to the boardroom, was now heavily wrinkled, stained with dark patches of nervous sweat, and covered in dust from the moving truck. He started rocking back and forth, crying hysterically. He looked up at his mother, his face twisted into a mask of pure, agonizing jealousy, and screamed at the top of his lungs, asking her why I was the one standing there. He pointed a shaking finger at me and screamed that I was supposed to be the failure. He yelled, "Why does she get everything? Why does she get the glass mansion, while my wife just walked out and left me with absolutely nothing?" He screamed that I had dropped out of his shadow, that I was plain and boring, and that he was supposed to be the great black capitalist of the family. He beat his fists against the gravel, throwing a massive, pathetic toddler tantrum on the driveway of my estate. He was aggressively mourning the death of his unearned superiority. He was weeping for the illusion that had just been violently stripped away, leaving him exposed as a completely incompetent fraud who now lived in a rented box truck. Watching her golden son wailing in the dirt finally pushed my mother over the edge of sanity. Brenda simply snapped. Her deeply ingrained narcissism kicked in immediately, desperately trying to rewrite the narrative to protect her own ego. She could not accept that her entire life was a lie, so she forcefully twisted the reality in front of her to fit her toxic programming. Brenda completely ignored my armed security guards and marched aggressively toward me. Her face was tight with a psychotic level of entitlement. She stopped just a few feet away from me, her eyes darting frantically over my silk clothes. She let out a breathless, frantic laugh and told me that God truly works in mysterious ways. She actually clasped her hands together and declared that the Lord had clearly blessed me with all this absurd, unearned wealth, specifically so that I could step up and save my family in their hour of need. Without a single ounce of hesitation, without any shame or humility, Brenda demanded that I sign the deed to the $20 million villa over to DeAndre immediately. She pointed to my brother weeping on the gravel and told me that he needed this house right now. She said his wife had left him, and that if he could just bring Courtney to this incredible beachfront estate, she would definitely take him back. Brenda looked me dead in the eye and told me that I was a single, practical woman who did not need a mansion. She said it was my fundamental duty as a sister to sacrifice my assets to rebuild the family legacy. She ordered me to call my lawyers right this second and transfer ownership to DeAndre so he could resume his rightful place as a business titan. The sheer staggering magnitude of her delusion hung in the salty ocean breeze. She honestly believed that my entire existence, my empire, my wealth was just a holding account waiting to be handed over to her golden son the moment he asked for it. I did not laugh. I did not yell. I did not even change my facial expression. I simply looked at the woman who had spent my entire life calling me an ugly disappointment. I took another slow sip of my vintage wine, letting the dark liquid coat my tongue. I handed the crystal glass to one of my security guards without looking at him. I took a step closer to my mother, completely invading her personal space and forcing her to look up into my cold, dead eyes. And then I delivered the absolute most brutal, factual economic takedown of their entire miserable lives. I spoke with a quiet, surgical precision, slicing through her delusions with absolute mathematical clarity. I told Brenda that she was fundamentally misunderstanding the situation. I explained that I was not blessed with sudden wealth. I built a ruthless, highly diversified holding company while she was busy bragging to her church friends about DeAndre's rented Bentley. I looked down at DeAndre, who had stopped crying and was now staring up at me in terrified silence. I broke it down for them, piece by excruciating piece. I explained exactly how I had orchestrated their total financial annihilation. I told them that Vanguard Freight had been bleeding cash for over 2 years, and that the traditional banking sector had completely blacklisted DeAndre long ago. I explained that when he went looking for a high-risk, predatory cash injection to save his failing logistics company, he had unknowingly walked right into the jaws of Apex Holdings. I told him that I was the one who approved the loan. I was the one who authorized the distribution of funds. I was the one who happily wired him the cash, knowing exactly how reckless and stupid he was. I looked at Calvin, who was still leaning against the U-Haul looking like a ghost. I told my father that when he secretly took out the second mortgage on the family mansion to bail out his son, the bank immediately sold that toxic debt on the secondary market. I told him that Apex Holdings bought that debt for pennies on the dollar. I bought his house. I bought the walls Brenda used to project her superiority. I bought the roof over their heads. I turned my attention back to my mother, her face now frozen in absolute unadulterated horror. I explained that I had sat back and quietly monitored every single transaction they made. I watched as DeAndre took the operating capital I loaned him and bought Courtney a diamond push present. I watched as he paid for luxury car leases and expensive country club dinners instead of paying his vendors. I let them fund their absolute vanity on my credit. I allowed them to gorge themselves on an illusion of wealth that was entirely financed by my empire. Every single designer suit DeAndre wore to pretend he was a CEO was paid for by me. Every single catered luncheon Brenda hosted to show off to the pastor's wife was paid for by me. I owned the very fabric of their fake reality. And the moment DeAndre breached the strict covenants of the contract, I triggered the default clause. I legally executed a hostile takeover. I liquidated Vanguard Freight to recover my assets, and I foreclosed on the family mansion because Calvin had defaulted on the heavily leveraged equity payments. I told them that I did not just beat them, I completely consumed them. I dismantled their entire toxic ecosystem using nothing but their own greed and financial incompetence against them. I looked down at DeAndre, who was now trembling violently on the white stones, realizing that his sister, the woman he had always treated like trash, had essentially been playing him like a puppet on a string for years. I looked back at Brenda, whose eyes were brimming with tears of sheer panic, as the devastating reality of my words finally crushed her delusional programming. I told her very clearly that I would never sign over a single square inch of my property to a man who had stolen from his own employees to fund his wife's baby shower. I told her that the family legacy she was so desperate to protect was nothing but a rotten house of cards built on debt lies and pure unearned arrogance, and that I was the wind that finally blew it down. I stepped back, smoothing the fabric of my silk trousers. The warm ocean breeze swept across the driveway, rustling the leaves of the palm trees. The silence that followed my speech was absolute and heavy. There were no more demands. There were no more screams of entitlement. There was only the crushing, suffocating weight of total defeat. Calvin, Brenda, and DeAndre were completely exposed, stripped of their titles, their homes, and their false pride. They were standing on the driveway of a $20 million estate owned by the daughter they had discarded with nothing to their names but the dirty clothes on their backs and a rented moving truck. I turned to my lead security contractor and gave him a brief nod. I looked back at my ruined family one final time and told them they had exactly 5 minutes to get back into their grimy U-Haul and turn it around. I warned them that if the truck was still idling on my pristine driveway when the clock ran out, my security team would forcefully remove them for trespassing on private property and hand them directly over to the local police. I did not wait for a response. I did not need to see them scramble back into the cab of the truck. I simply turned my back on them and walked slowly up the floating concrete stairs toward the massive glass doors of my home. I took the crystal glass of vintage wine back from my guard, taking a final deeply satisfying sip as the heavy doors glided shut behind me, sealing me inside my fortress and leaving them outside to rot in the wreckage of their own making. But before the heavy glass doors could click into their final locking mechanism, Calvin broke away from the side of the moving truck and lunged toward the base of the steps. He was weeping openly now, his face a contorted mask of pure grief and absolute desperation. He screamed my name, his voice cracking and echoing against the sleek modern architecture of my estate. He begged me to stop telling me that I could not do this to my own flesh and blood. He wailed that I was destroying Black generational wealth, that I was tearing down the sacred legacy his ancestors had suffered to build, and that I was actively cursing our family name forever. I stopped walking. I turned around slowly, the crystal glass still feeling cool and perfectly balanced against my palm. I walked back to the very edge of the floating concrete steps, looking down at the pathetic weeping man who had once terrified me with his booming authoritarian voice. I told him he needed to understand the absolute totality of his ruin because I wanted him to carry the exact math of his failure to his grave. I did not just buy your foreclosed debt, I told him with a chilling factual precision. I explained that I had also bought the commercial land that Vanguard Freight sat on. I informed DeAndre, who was still rocking back and forth on the crushed white stones like a broken child, that the demolition crews and bulldozers were already scheduled to arrive tomorrow morning at exactly 6 a.m. I told them that the crew was going to raze his precious logistics headquarters to the ground, leaving absolutely nothing but dust. and that I had already signed the permits to pour concrete over the rubble to build a massive commercial parking structure. I turned my dead, unfeeling eyes back to Calvin. I told him that I had also bought the mortgage on their beloved suburban mansion, the pristine estate Brenda had used to terrorize her church friends and assert her dominance over the local hierarchy. I explained that I had absolutely no intention of keeping their toxic monument. I told them I had already sold the deed to a ruthless commercial developer who specialized in cheap retail construction. I looked directly at my mother and told her that her flawless white living room, her imported Italian leather sofas, and the arched entryway where she used to belittle me were going to be demolished by the end of the month to make way for a discount strip mall. Calvin let out a horrifying, ragged choke, collapsing to his knees right beside DeAndre in the dirt. He sobbed heavily into his trembling hands, repeating the phrase generational wealth over and over like a broken, tragic record. I looked down at the two men sobbing on my driveway and felt absolutely nothing. There was no pity, no guilt, and no lingering sense of familial duty. I told him very clearly, "You did not build generational wealth, Calvin. You built a parasitic ego project entirely on my back. You used my quiet competence to fund a flashy illusion for a son who possessed absolutely zero business acumen. And when the money finally ran out, you mortgaged your own shelter to keep the pathetic lie alive." I took a final slow sip of the vintage red wine, letting the silence stretch out and suffocate them before I delivered the ultimate, indisputable truth. I told him, "I am the generational wealth now, and none of you are in my bloodline." Brenda let out a blood-curdling shriek. The reality of the discount strip mall, the permanent loss of her mega-church status, the absolute evaporation of her vanity, and the finality of my words finally broke her brain completely. She became entirely unhinged. She lunged forward, trying to force her way past the armed private security contractors, scratching and clawing the air like a rabid animal, desperately trying to reach me on the steps. She screamed that I owed them, that it was my fundamental duty as a sister and a daughter to rebuild their empire, because his wife had left him and he needed this house. I did not flinch. I did not move a single muscle or take a single step backward. I simply gave a millimeter of a nod to the lead guard standing to my right. The massive security contractors moved with brutal, silent efficiency. They physically intercepted Brenda, blocking her chaotic path with their solid, immovable bulk, and forcefully shoved her back toward the dirty, rented moving truck. The lead guard put his hand firmly on his holstered weapon and ordered them in a deep voice that sounded like crushed gravel to get back into their U-Haul and leave the premises immediately, or they would be arrested and processed for criminal trespassing. I turned around and walked back up the pristine floating steps, entering the cool, quiet sanctuary of my $20 million villa. The heavy glass doors sealed shut behind me with a solid mechanical click, instantly cutting off the pathetic muffled sounds of their weeping and screaming. I walked into the expansive living room, bathed in the warm golden afternoon sunlight, and stood still. I watched through the massive floor-to-ceiling windows as Calvin dragged his hysterical wife and his broken son back into the cramped cab of the grimy U-Haul truck. I watched the exhaust sputter as the heavy vehicle slowly reversed down my immaculate white gravel driveway. I watched it shrink in the rearview mirror of my life until it disappeared entirely through the massive wrought iron gates backing out of my existence forever. I pulled my phone from my silk pocket and calmly switched the settings to Do Not Disturb. There would be no dramatic screaming matches later tonight. There would be no tearful apologies or desperate requests for a second chance. There would be absolutely no forgiveness because they did not deserve any. I walked out onto the expansive back terrace and looked out at the endless crashing waves of the Pacific Ocean, taking a deep grounding breath of the clean, salty air. The silence surrounding me was magnificent and absolute. I had not just survived their deeply toxic ecosystem, I had completely consumed it and burned it to ash. I stood there feeling the warm sun on my face, basking in the absolute untouchable peace of a self-made billionaire who had finally taken out the trash. The greatest lesson from Alana's journey is that your true worth is never defined by a toxic family who only values you when you are convenient. Blood does not automatically grant someone the right to your respect or your hard-earned resources. When people treat you like a burden, you owe them absolutely nothing. True generational wealth is not just about money. It is about building a solid foundation of integrity, total independence, and unshakable self-respect. Sometimes the most powerful revenge is simply walking away, building your own empire in silence, and letting the garbage take itself out once and for all. If you have ever had to cut off toxic family members to protect your peace, please share your story in the comments below and hit subscribe for more stories of ultimate survival.